So when it gets hot, you know, you get 90-degree water, you get middle of summer, a lot of population of fish, they go offshore. And specifically, in my area, they go offshore and they get on brush piles. So when it comes to fishing brush piles, I'm gonna kind of tell you my main baits and kind of my strategy for targeting and how I approach a lot of these brush piles. So when it comes to finding brush piles, or fishing brush piles, you gotta find the brush piles. That's the key, is finding them. So you have to use your electronics to find them. I graph a lot. I love to graph for offshore fish and brush and things like that. But I've kind of came up with kind of the setup I use. I use 2 depth finders. I have 2 HDS 12s back here, 2 Lowrances, but you don't have to have 2. I'm just gonna show you kind of my split of the way I look for the brush. So what I like to do, I like to run a map and a 2D on one unit. But the 2D, to be honest, is kind of irrelevant. You can really just run the map. But on one unit, I like a full screen side scan. And I run this full screen side scan just because I became accustomed to the size of the fish, the size of brush, with it in full screen. If I go splitting it up, it makes my screens a lot smaller. Whether you run a 7-inch unit, a 9-inch unit, I suggest getting used to, whether you split it or don't, get used to one specific size that you're always graphing on. Because if you start changing it up, you start not getting a good mental picture of what you're seeing. So I always run mine on side scan predominantly. And then when I go over something that I think looks like a likely spot, whether I see a brush pile to the side on side scan or I go straight over it in the water column right under the boat, I keep my down scan and I switch back to the down scan. Because down scan will show fish really well and it'll show the brush to give you a better mental picture of what you're fishing and to know how many fish are there. Whereas side scan will show you the gist of the brush. It'll show you like where it is, you know, whether it's right, left, under the boat. But it's really, really, really hard to tell if there's actually even fish on it. Whereas down scan will show you the fish. So I always run full screen side and switch back and forth between down and side. A lot of people split them, half side, half down. And that's a viable way if you get used to that ratio. But I'm used to the full screen ratio. I just idled over a brush pile here, and then I looped the boat around, and I'm gonna go directly over it just so I can get a good idea if there's any fish on it. And now you're starting to see it. So a lot of these little bitty specks here are actually bluegills, but then you get some bigger dots, like that one's probably a bass, things like that. But when you go over it on side, you just see kind of a fuzz. You don't know what it is. When you go straight over it, you get to see actually how it lays out. This is a pretty tall, like a 7-foot brush pile, and all these tiny dots here, some could be spotted bass, a lot are bluegills. The bigger largemouths will usually sit kind of around the bottom of the base of the brush. This one doesn't have a load of largemouths, at least I can tell, but it does look like it has some spotted bass. I see a few larger dots in there sitting up high, which usually are spotted bass. Largemouths tend to like the bottom right around it. And I think this, just because I know this specific spot, some of these that look a lot like fish are probably stumps on the bottom, but these up high, usually if you see the mother lode up high in a pile, generally they're either small bass or not bass. Largemouths love to sit kind of in a uniform line down on the bottom. Lining up on a brush pile, when you pull up on them, it's really important on how you pull up on the brush pile. So what I like to do, I put my range rings on my map of my Lowrance. So my range rings right now at the bottom, I've got a circle on the screen here at different feet, and it shows 250 feet is my range ring. So I like to zoom in until my range rings are 150 feet, and then that's when I cut the boat off. When the brush pile hits that range ring, it's time to cut the boat off. And you always want to be pointing directly at the brush, and you want to pull up downwind, because if you pull up crooked or you pull up with the wind kind of blowing from the side, your boat gets all spun around. I know with front sonar nowadays you can see it, but we're talking about how to approach it without front sonar. When you're pulling up, you always want to cut the boat off about 150 feet from it, and then you know you have a lineup with that pine tree or that dock or whatever that may be, because you're pointed directly over the trolling motor at the brush. Don't ever pull up crooked. Don't ever pull up on the side wind with it. You always want to pull up downwind so you're trolling straight at it and you're not getting pushed on top of it. Most lakes when you're fishing brush, we're kind of at the point on this lake. Later in the summer, a lot of the fish still stay there, but they get harder and harder to catch. A lot of lakes with a lot of brush piles means there's a lot of night tournaments, a lot of things like that. So they get pressured a lot. They just get harder and harder to catch as the year goes. But still, a lot of times, depending on the lake, it's still one of the best ways. Got a fish right there. Got him. Still one of the best ways to catch them all summer. Oh, he came off. There's another spotted bass. Fishing brush piles with or without front sonar, I've had a lot of people ask me that, you know, maybe haven't been fishing as long, or people that have been fishing pretty serious last few years, they're like, how do you fish brush without front sonar? And I mean, it's one of those things. I've fished brush piles for, you know, as long as I've been fishing, for 25 years. And front sonar, yeah, makes it a lot easier, makes it more efficient. You can see how many are there. Active target will show you how many are there and show you exactly the direction to cast. But the whole key is the way you approach the brush. You always want to pull up, and you have to have a lineup on the bank. A lot of people use marker buoys if you don't have front sonar. I've never really been a marker buoy guy. I've always had, as long as you have GPS, I've had plenty of success just pulling up and lining up, basing it off a cast towards the bank, or just keeping the boat in one place rather than putting the marker buoy out, because I don't like have to run over the pile first. The only time I will use a marker buoy is a lot of times you got a lot of wind, maybe current. You can drop that marker buoy beside the boat rather than on your brush, because you got your line up. You already know I'm throwing at that pine tree or that dock. But you drop your marker buoy beside the boat and you keep the boat in the same place, because GPS is great with it, but it has a little bit of a kind of error as far as which way you're facing, things like that. So it's a lot easier if you do have a buoy, but once you get good enough with the GPS and your line up when you first pull up, which is a key, you can hit it without the front sonar. I've noticed fishing brush piles too since the days of front sonar. So like I said, I used to fish them for years. I think you followed the other year in the Bassmaster Elites. I didn't even have active target at the time. And I was just pulling up and fishing the brush piles. But what I've learned is when you're fishing them, if you have the front sonar, definitely use it to line up on the brush and get your cast to land in the brush, but don't rely on it too much to see the fish and get them to bite. With like that spoon, it's a little different because you need to not get hung. But with a worm or something like that, a lot of those fish will kind of hide down in that brush and you can't see them. So if you've got the front sonar, if you don't, just drag through it like you normally would. But if you got the front sonar, just use it to kind of get your bait where it needs to be. Don't get too focused on getting your bait in front of the fish in the brush. So there's 5 baits that I would say are my primary baits I fish brush with. Like, there's a lot of variations of this around the country, or maybe, you know, situational, but there's 5 baits pretty much if I know I'm going to fish brush that I always have tied on. So the main bait all around the country, fishing brush piles, is a Texas rig worm. Simple, basic, but I just use a 4 or 5/0 offset worm hook, and anywhere from a 5/16 to a 3/8 ounce Texas rig weight. I like to peg mine. You'll hear a lot of differences on pegging versus not pegging. I like to peg mine just because it seems like you get hung a little less. You know when you get a bite a little bit better because the weight's right there on the bait. I think it's hit or miss whether or not it makes a difference. I just usually peg mine. So red bug is one of my favorite all-time worms. This is a mag U-tail zoom worm here. This is one I really, really like because it's a big worm, but it's not overly big. Old Monster is a really good worm if you got some bigger fish in the lake. But red bug and green pumpkin are my go-to colors on a Texas rig. I use my long game Cobb Series rod with 16-pound test is kind of my go-to T7 fluorocarbon for the Texas rig worm. And along the same lines of a Texas rig worm, a lot of times I feel like the fish bite a shaky head style big worm better. So with that ribbon tail Texas rig I have on, I also have a big shaky head, like either a quarter, anywhere from a quarter to a ½ ounce, depending on depth, with a straight tail worm. This is Zoom Mag Trick Worm, also in red bug or green pumpkin, and it's the same setup. Long game rod, gravity reel with 16-pound T7 fluorocarbon. It's just sometimes I think that shaky head gets bit a little better than the Texas rig, but I always have both of them because this is get hung a lot more than the Texas rig is. Texas rig comes through a lot better. So along the same lines as the worm, gotta have a drop shot. This lake we're on now, it's got a bunch of spotted bass in it. So sometimes the spotted bass, they kind of shy away from, you know, that big Texas rig, that big mag trick worm, something like that. So I use the Z3 Original Zoom drop shot worm. I like a kind of slender, longer worm, 4 to 6 inches in the summer. And in the winter, I use a lot of stubby, like shad profile worms. But on a drop shot in the summertime, I like a long, thin worm. Use my fairy wand rod. It casts this a lot farther. It's a 7.3, so it's a longer rod, be able to cast out there, reach the brush piles. 10-pound super braid, 10-pound 100% fluorocarbon Yozuri leader. Pretty simple, but a drop shot is one of those baits you have to have tied on because sometimes they just don't want that bigger worm. Brush piles usually are put out by somebody, so the fish are pressured to. A drop shot will get bit when those bigger worms won't. And in the days of the front sonar, if you're fishing offshore, you've got to have some type of minnow profile bait on a jig head. 1/4 ounce, 3/16 ounce jig head, the same spinning rod setup. But if the fish are suspended high, a minnow bait, as tired as we are all of minnow baits, a minnow bait on a jig head is productive when the fish are sitting up high in a brush pile. And the last bait, a big goofy spoon. A big spoon is one of those things, if you get big largemouth out offshore anywhere, whether they're on ledges, brush, anything like this can get a reaction bite from some of the biggest fish in the brush. The one problem is, depending on how I think the fish, how temperamental they are, if they're really biting or if they're just kind of, you know, sitting on that brush, the spoon, you can mess up a brush pile really, really easily because they tend to follow this. Whether they want to eat it or not, they're going to follow it out. So I only throw the spoon when I know the fish are feeding. I know there's big fish there, because if it's kind of tough time of year, you're just looking for, you know, a couple bites or a bite per every other brush pile. This spoon a lot of times will kind of pull the fish off and then you can't catch them on the worm. So you only want to lead with this when you know they're there and you know they're big ones. There's a bite, did you get it? Yep. My drag's too loose, but I got him. I think it's a big spot. It is. Oh, big spotted bass on the shaky head. Got my worm entirely. That's the cool thing about brush piles. You get a lot of largemouth and spotted bass. That's a good sized spotted bass for this lake. But everything kind of gets out here in the summer. Lakes with spotted bass kind of guarantees you catch something too, so that's the cool thing. Oh God, there's a bunch. Go, 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 go. God, they're swimming so fast, holy. That's where all the spots are. It's a big spotted bass. So it's getting late. It's getting late in the summer. And that was one of those instances where front sonar probably made me catch that fish. I was fishing a brush pile and a school probably was on the brush. It started roaming around. They were just following some bait and I threw at them and got this dude right here. There's just fish following bait out in, a lot of times in the later summer, the fish that were up on some structure, they'll kind of start roaming around in the middle and following bait around. That's kind of a late summer, fall thing that they kind of transition from the brush to kind of the open water following bait. So there was one big one in it, and he's chasing the shit out of it. Got one. I don't think it's a bass. It is a bass, he's just little bitty. A little bass on a big spoon. It's amazing what a bass thinks he can eat, whether he can or not. They try.